Well, hello again. It's time for another tale, and by popular demand, I have chosen The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Now, if you're familiar with the Disney version of this story, you better brace yourself. It's a little bit different, and let's just say the ending isn't quite Disney. I really hope you enjoy it. Let's sit back, make sure you've got yourself a cuppa, and enjoy a bit of storytelling. So here it is, the first part of The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Far out in the wide sea, where the water is blue as the loveliest cornflower and clear as the purest crystal, where it is so deep that very, very many church towers must be heaped one upon another in order to reach from the lowest depth to the surface above, there dwell the Mer people. Now you must not imagine that there is nothing but sand below the water. Oh no, indeed, far from it. Trees and plants of wondrous beauty grow there, whose stems and leaves are so bright that they are waved to and fro by the slightest motion of the water, almost as if they were living things. Fishes, great and small, glide in and out among the branches, just as birds fly among our trees. Where the water is deepest stands the palace of the Mer King. The walls of this palace are of coral, and the high-pointed windows are of amber. The roof, however, is composed of mussel shells, which, as the billows pass over them, are continually opening and shutting. This looks exceedingly pretty, especially as each of these mussel shells contains a number of bright glittering pearls, one only of which would be the most costly ornament in the diadem of a king in the upper world. Now the Mer King, who lived in this palace, had been for many years a widower. His old mother managed the household affairs for him. She was, on the whole, a sensible sort of lady, although extremely proud of her high birth and station, on which account she wore 12 oysters on her tail, whilst the other inhabitants of the sea, even those of distinction, were only allowed 6. In every other respect, she merited unlimited praise, especially for the affection she showed to the 6 little princesses, her granddaughters. They were all very beautiful children. The youngest was, however, the most lovely. Her skin was as soft and delicate as a rose leaf. Her eyes were of as deep a blue as the sea. But, like all other mermaids, she had no feet. Her body ended in a tail like that of a fish. Now the whole day long the children used to play in the spacious apartments of the palace, where beautiful flowers grew out of walls on all sides around them. When the great amber windows were opened, fishes would swim into these apartments as swallows fly into our rooms. But the fishes were bolder than the swallows. They swam straight up to the little princess's hands and ate from them, allowing themselves to be caressed. In front of the palace there was a large garden, full of fiery red and dark blue trees, whose fruit glittered like gold, and whose flowers resembled a bright burning sun. The sand that formed the soil of the garden was of a bright blue colour, something like flames of sulphur, and a strange, beautiful blue was spread over the whole, so that one might have fancied oneself raised very high in the air, with the sky at once above and below, certainly not the bottom of the sea. When the waters were quite still, the sun might have been looking like a purple flower, out of whose cup streamed forth the light of the world. Now, each of the little princesses had her own plot in the garden, where she might plant and sow at her pleasure. One chose hers to be made in the shape of a whale, another preferred the figure of a mermaid, but the youngest had hers quite round like the sun, and planted in it only those flowers that were red, as the sun seemed to her. She was certainly a very singular child, very quiet and thoughtful. While her sisters were adorning themselves with all sorts of gay things that came out of a ship which had been wrecked, she asked for nothing but a beautiful white marble statue of a boy which had been found in it. She put the statue in her garden and planted a red weeping willow by its side. The tree grew up quickly and let its long boughs fall upon the bright blue ground, where ever-moving shadows played in violet hues, as if boughs and roots were embracing. Nothing pleased the little princess more than to hear about the world of human beings living above the sea. She made her old grandmother tell her everything she knew about ships and towns and men and land animals, and was particularly pleased when she heard that the flowers of the upper world had a pleasant fragrance, for the flowers of the sea are scentless, and that the woods were green and the fishes fluttering among the branches of various gay colours, and that they could sing with a loud, clear voice. The old lady meant birds, of course, but she called them fishes because her grandchildren, having never seen a bird, would not otherwise have understood her. "When you have attained your 15th year," added she, "you will be permitted to rise to the surface of the sea. You will then sit by moonlight in the clefts of the rocks, see the ships sail by, and learn to distinguish towns and men." The next year the eldest of the sisters reached this happy age. But the others, alas, well, the second sister was a year younger than the eldest, the third a year younger than the second, and so on. The youngest still had 5 whole years to wait till that joyful time should come when she might also rise to the surface of the water and see what was going on in the upper world. However, the eldest promised to tell the others of everything she might see when the first day of her being of age arrived, for the grandmother gave them but little information, and there was so much that they wished to hear. But none of all the sisters longed so ardently for the day when she should be released from childish restraint as the youngest, she who had longest to wait and was so quiet and thoughtful. Many a night she stood by the open window looking up through the clear blue water, whilst the fishes were leaping and playing around her. She could see the sun and the moon. Their light was pale, but they appeared larger than they do to those who live in the upper world. If a shadow passed over them, she knew it must be either a whale or a ship sailing by full of human beings, who indeed little thought that far beneath them a little mermaid was passionately stretching forth her white hands towards their ship's keel. The day had now arrived when the eldest princess had attained her 15th year, and was therefore allowed to rise up to the surface of the sea. When she returned, she had 1,000 things to relate. Her chief pleasure had been to sit upon a sandbank in the moonlight, looking at the large town which lay on the coast, where lights were beaming like stars and where music was playing. She had heard the distant noise of men and carriages. She had seen the high church towers, had listened to the ringing of the bells, and, just because she could not go there, she longed to do more things after this. How attentively did her younger sister listen to her words! And when she next stood at night time by her open window, gazing up through the blue waters, she thought so intensely of the great noisy city that she fancied she could almost hear the church bells ringing. Next year, the second sister received permission to swim wherever she pleased. She rose to the surface of the sea just when the sun was setting, and this sight so delighted her that she declared it to be more beautiful than anything else she had seen above the waters. "The whole sky seemed tinged with gold," said she, "and it is impossible for me to describe to you the beauty of the clouds. Now red, now violet, they glided over me. But still more swiftly flew over the water a flock of white swans, just where the sun was descending. I looked after them, but the sun disappeared, and the bright rosy light on the surface of the sea and on the edges of the clouds was gradually extinguished." It was now time for the third sister to visit the upper world. She was the boldest of the 6, and ventured up a river. On its shores she saw green hills covered with woods and vineyards, from among which rose houses and castles. She heard the birds singing, and the sun shone with so much power that she was continually obliged to plunge below in order to cool her burning face. In the little bay she met with a number of children, who were bathing and jumping about. She would have joined in their gambols, but the children fled back to land in great terror, and a little black animal barked at her in such a manner that she herself was frightened at last, and swam back to the sea. She could not, however, forget the green woods, the verdant hills, and the pretty children, who, although they had no fins, were swimming about in the river so fearlessly. The fourth sister was not so bold. She remained in the open sea, and said on her return home she thought nothing could be more beautiful. She had seen ships sailing by so far off that they looked like seagulls. She had watched the merry dolphins gambling in the water and the enormous whales sending up into the air 1,000 sparkling fountains. The year after, the fifth sister attained her 15th year. Her birthday happened at a different season to that of her sisters. It was winter. The sea of a green colour and immense icebergs were floating on its surface. These, she said, looked like pearls. They were, however, much larger than the church towers in the land of human beings. She sat down upon one of these pearls and let the wind play with her long hair. But then all the ships hoisted their sails in terror and escaped as quickly as possible. In the evening the sky was covered with sails, and whilst the great mountains of ice alternately sank and rose again and beamed with a reddish glow, flashes of lightning burst forth from the clouds, and the thunder rolled on, peal after peal. The sails of all the ships were instantly furled, and horror and affright reigned on board, but the princess sat still on the iceberg, looking unconcernedly at the bright blue zigzag of the flashes. The first time that either of these sisters rode out of the sea, she was quite enchanted at the sight of so many new and beautiful objects. But the novelty was soon over, and it was not long ere their own home appeared more attractive than the upper world, for there only did they find everything agreeable. Many an evening would the five sisters rise hand in hand from the depths of the ocean. Their voices were far sweeter than any human voice, and when a storm was coming on, they would swim in front of the ships and sing. Oh, how sweetly did they sing, describing the happiness of those who lived at the bottom of the sea, and entreating the sailors not to be afraid, but to come down to them. The mariners, however, did not understand their words. They fancied the song was only the whistling of the wind, and thus they lost their hidden glories of the sea. For if their ships were wrecked, all on board were drowned, and none but dead men ever entered the Mer-King's palace. Whilst the sisters were swimming at evening time, the youngest would remain motionless and alone in her father's palace, looking up after them. She would have wept, but mermaids cannot weep, and therefore, when they are troubled, suffer infinitely more than human beings do. "Oh, if I were but 15, sighed she. "I know that I should love the upper world and its inhabitants so much." Well, at last, the time she had longed for so much arrived. "Well, now it is your turn," said the grandmother. "Come here, that I may adorn you like your sisters." And she wound around her hair a wreath of white lilies, whose every petal was half of a pearl, and then commanded 8 large oysters to fasten themselves to the princess's tail in token of her high rank. "But that is so very uncomfortable," said the little princess. "One must not mind slight inconveniences when one wishes to look well," said the old lady. How willingly would the princess have given up all this splendour and exchanged her heavy crown for the red flowers of her garden, which was so much more becoming of her, but she dared not do so. "Farewell," said she, and she rose from the sea, light as a flake of foam. I wonder what's going to happen to her on her adventures. We'll have to find out in the next part. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.